we have we have the idea of comparative literature from the historical perspectives. We have learned many issues regarding comparative literature, the French school of comparative literature, American school of comparative literature, and the comparative literature that goes up to the other parts of this world. Today, we will try to have a look at the comparative literature and the comparative identities in the post-colonial world. Here in 1492, there is a historical incident happened, that is this Spanish navigator Christopher Columbus. He discovered a way to reach American continent. America. He discovered America, and whenever he discovered America in 1492, actually Columbus started his journey towards the ocean blue and landed somewhere in the place called Bahamas, and then sailed to Cuba and then Hispaniola, and then he returned back to Spain. And he announced that, yes, I have discovered a alternative route to reach to the Orient. Actually, Orient, Columbus thought that he has reached Asia, okay, through this route, and his belief was that that is through the Atlantic there might be an alternative way to reach the other parts of Asia, Cuba, and China. Actually, Columbus reached in first coast of Cathay, that is called the Cathay, and that is the first of the part of the West Indies. And before the discovery of Columbus, we see the map of the world was like this. That is, this portion was totally blank, and there is the Asia, Europe, and this part, only the Greenland was there, and this portion was blank. And Columbus came here and also reached actually the Cathay, the place is called Cathay. Okay. And this Cathay is a part of Hong Kong, and that is located in Hong Kong. And there you see that this is the route. So Columbus started from here and he reached here over there. And from that uh, time, this place became the communication hub towards the all parts of this world. As you see the map, that from this place anybody can fly towards the other parts of this world. And West Indies actually is a part of this uh, North America. So it's blurrish, a little blurrish. You can see that it is West Indies here. Okay, so between North America and uh, America, Latin America and North America, these are the West Indies. So Columbus reached over there. And uh, actually, Columbus wanted to establish the road towards the Asia, and that is the East Indies. West Indies is a part between Latin America and North America, but West Indies, East Indies is a part in Asia, as you see that it is related here, Indonesia, Philippines, and the other new parts of it. So if you make a division of East India, so East India in between Latin America and North America here, and the West East Indies is there. Okay, so that is. So our concern is that after the discovery of Columbus, okay, in 1942, it was a discovery of reaching the other parts of this world. And after 500 years of Columbus's discovery, we get a different history. What's the history that is? It is assumed that Columbus's discovery happened in 1492, but many say that before Columbus, 100 years before of Columbus's discovery, that region was discovered by the Norwegian sailors. Okay. So when the European countries were trying to observe the 5 years celebration of Columbus's discovery, we have got a different history. That is the history that is the Norwegian sailors discovered America 100 years before Columbus's discovery. It means that before Columbus's discovery, there are some natives had been living in these areas, that means in Americas, that is American continent. It means that the other civilization had been living in America before Columbus's discovery, and they had their identity. They had their identity in terms of language, culture, and place. That is the scenario. That means after Columbus's discovery, we have got an America, but before Columbus's discovery, we had a different American continent. They have their natives, they have their language, they had their language, and they had their culture. And in this regard, the English professor, Professor Peter Hume, he comes up with this idea. He has written some writing. Hume had a different history. He said that after Columbus's discovery, Europeans like English, French, Spanish, and the Portuguese, they started to move towards the new world, that is America. And but the new world had a confrontation with the old native inhabitants of the new world. So when the people of Europe, that means English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, started moving towards America, they had a confrontation with the people or with the inhabitants of old America. There was a confrontation, and that the for the arrival of the Europeans, the pre-Columbian civilization of the Americans, their languages, their names were dispossessed or exterminated or doomed. It means that before Columbus's discovery, there had been inhabitants in America. They had their culture, they had their language, they had their identity. After the discovery, people from Europe, that means English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, they started to move towards America, and they had a confrontation. And basically, it is said that the pre-Columbian civilization living in America, they were uh, doomed. Their identity, their language, their civilization, everything were dispossessed, exterminated, or doomed. So that is the history. But apart from that, Peter Hume also investigated the causes why so many people from European started to move towards the new country. So Hume investigated the relationship between Europeans and the native Caribbeans and the people living in this area. He said that it was from 1492 to 1725. That was the colonial encounters. That means that the European people had an encounter with the people living in these Caribbean countries and these American countries. So Peter Hume investigated and worked on several anthropological aspects and the works in favor of his study. And he said that this the reasons of European investigation into non-European countries and culture. And he claimed that is other civilization in pre-Columbian time were uh, truculent, ferocious, warlike, hostile, vindictive, and so on. So it is there and cannibals as well. So the pre-Columbusian uh, America and the Caribbean, the people were hostile, ferocious, warlike, and Caliban. But what is the reason of visiting this country? Uh, that first time after the discovery of Columbus, the early explorer desired for the fabulous wealth that was said to be waiting for them to find. Actually, the people, the European people, they thought that America, the New World, will be a treasure house for their future, for their wealth, for their for their new life in there. So they thought that is there will be a better future over there. And also, they had another civilizing mission. What is the civilization mission? That is the Caribbean people, the American people. They were warlike, ferocious, hostile, and in order to civilize themselves, and in order to make them quite similar to their civilization and to their own culture, they try to uplift the position of the people living in this area. That was the situation. So when that is the situation that was happening towards the several periods, several years, several hundred years, that situation was going on. And uh, here we see another two scholars, the Mexican historian, and we see another person, his name, Mexican novelist, his name is Carlos Fuentes. Carlos Fuentes said and claimed that the European had a desire for a new, better world, one world which would be the ideals of civilization. That means, according to Carlos Fuentes, that means America will be a place of new world like utopia, like a better civilization that's been waiting. In one hand, they will have the better future, they will have the wealth, they will have the vast area, everything they will be getting in America. So, Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes also claimed that issue. And next time we have seen that their desire for utopia was a failure. Okay. So why it was a failure, we will see. Okay. So here we get another analogy, that is the early Portuguese explorer who encountered African civilization were not motivated by utopian social vision, but the economic goals. So apart from the English, French, the Portuguese, they didn't have their civilization mission. They want they wanted only the economic goals. They wanted to profit from their investigation towards the other parts of this world. Okay, and then the movement into the interior of the North and the South America came quite quickly, and Carlos advanced through what is now Mexico, Pizarro through the lands and the Inacas of the Andes, and the French and the English moved rapidly inland from the eastern seaboard and today's Canada and the United States. Okay. And as the native population of the Americas were disseminated, an increasing number of slaves were transported across the Atlantic and the expanding settlement of plantation in Americas. So the European, they had their civilizing mission, and they also had the idea that they will have better future over there, and they will have vast land in America. And apart from this, in order to cultivate the vast land of America, many slaves were needed. And at that time, the slaves, they were collected from the countries, that is the African country, and they are transported to the American parts for the plantation purposes. So it becomes, at that time, the slave trading became the lucrative business both for Europeans and both for Norwegians, French, and other parts. So they started to collect slaves from the European, from the African countries and transported those slaves for the plantation project that was going on in the vast land area of America. So that was the place. And why that is the place? And actually, this idea that is uh, in a way that means these people, that means African people, they had been living in the darkest place of this world. Actually, from the darkest place, these slaves were transported to the new world, that means the America. That is their mission. Actually, within the mission, there was another goal, that is the lucrative slave business that were doing by the European and the Norwegian sailors and explorers at the time. So that was the situation. And in that um, uh, situation, uh, we come across with another writer, Ole Soyinka. And Ole Soyinka, we know that he is a Nigerian playwright. Ole Soyinka, he comes up as a professor of comparative literature and literature and the African world. He attempts in his early 1970 decades to give series of lectures on African literature in Cambridge, where he was visiting fellow, and his lectures were given under the aegis of the Department of Social Anthropology, and for the English department didn't believe in any such bits in African literature. And the study of African culture had been classified in a particular way, and the object of that study was anthropological, not literary. So Ole Soyinka, he had been delivering lectures at Cambridge based on the African literature. But what is the problem over there? In Africa, in America, and in the other parts of Europe, actually African study, that means African literature study, was not doing in the department, that is the Department of African Language or like that. They had been doing as a part of a department, that is the African literature will be a sub-genre or sub-subject of other fields like Department of English or the anthropological subjects. That was happening in Cambridge or at Cambridge or the other parts of this world that Ole Soyinka delivered in his speech. That means African literature didn't have uh, an individual identity towards the other parts of this world. So Soyinka's criticism of the marginalization of African literature. Actually, African literature was marginalized. So English literature, they will have an identity. The other literature will have identity, but the African literature didn't have the identity at all at the time when Ole Soyinka had been criticizing the presence of African literature. So he draws attention to the anthropological bias of much European work on Africa. And just as Hume draws our attention to a similar vein, in the same way, Native American languages and cultures, the creation of the Center for African Study may be skipped forward in one respect, but all too often emphasis has been on social anthropology at the expense of literature. So Ole Soyinka's criticism was that African literature will be the part of African African literature, or it will have African literature will have an identity. But what I've been doing at that time, African literature had been a part. So what was the center? Center was that European literature. European literature was the center, and African literature had been gained as the sub-subject under the European literature. So African literature was marginalized and had not been studied separately as an individual decision, department or subjects at the time. So that was the situation that created in America and the other parts of this world. Okay, so we get another writer. His name is Chidi Amuda. feels that there is an ongoing crisis of confidence and consciousness in current African literary scholarship. So Chidi Amuda, yes, he is also a Nigerian writer, and he is also an African. He wrote the theory of African literature. Okay. So Chidi as Amuda also perceived the similar notion of Ole Soyinka. Uh, Soyinka's Chidi Amuda actually felt that the African literature didn't have the confidence and the identity. Actually, the African literature had been suffering for identity crisis in based of in comparison to the other literature of this world. So we have said this. So the studies of African literature cultures proliferated, and the crisis, he argues, derives from the double blind of a lack of definition of African literature. So he said that yes, that is how we will define African literature. Sidi Amuda said that actually African literature had been suffering for identity crisis. This is because we can't give definition of African literature. So he said that who an African is. To the Western mind, the African was and has remained a product of the heart of darkness. Most probably, you know the history of that novel, that is the Heart of Darkness. So, Heart of Darkness create an idea of towards the European people that the people living in Africa, they are, as I have learned a little bit earlier, like the American people, the African people are ferocious, warlike, hostile, vindictive. They are out of the civilization, so they live in the darkest side of this civilization, as they have no light of civilization, and that is their identity. So Chidi Amuta said that actually the African literature, they have their identification through the identification of their people. Although the people of Africa had been termed as the uh, 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 people or the inhabitant of the darkest part of this world, their literature will not have the individual identity. That is, Chidio Amuda mentioned. And the identity the European uh, had for African literature, because that the African literature will not be the individual literature. They will be studied at the part of anthropological subjects because they belong to a civilization. That civilization is very dark. That was claimed by Chido Amuda in his appraisal. And next time we have got another voice, a strong voice of comparative literature, actually. And his name is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer. And also he
Thiong'o.
Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kenyan writer. And he is the founder of the editor of the Gikoki language. The Kenyan people, they speak in a language. That language is called Giko-u. Giko-u. Yes, Giko-u language. So this Kenyan writer, he is very much bold in his approach. Ngugi wa Thiong'o said that with some of his colleagues, he said that in Kenya, the department name is Department of English. He said that after getting independence, it is not necessary to have a department named Department of English. So it is totally biased. In which way? He said that that is the broadly based compared. He said that the study of the language other than the study of literature. So here he said that if we have English department still in Kenya, that will again be the mentality. That means again we will be the we will be dominated by European literature. Okay, so in his essay on the evolution of English department, Ngogi argued that by continuing to teach the English tradition in an African context, uh, Africa was turned into an expansion of the West. So he said that if we continue Department of English in Kenya and Africa, so Africa again will be an extension of the West. That means Western people once upon a time had been dominating the Africa and Kenya as well. So we are we have got freedom, and if we do not get out of this English department, the we will again be in domination of the West. So that Africa and in Kenya, that will be an extension according to Ngogi wa Thiong'o, he said. Okay. So he also refers to the African Renaissance, noting the part played in that trend by Afro American writers and Caribbean writers. In short, he argued that their aim should be to orient ourselves towards placing Kenya, East Africa, and then Africa in the center. Okay, so in African continent, there are several countries out there. So Kenya, East Africa, West Africa, and the other parts of the center for this in this African continent. So he proposed that Africa will be center, and the other literature like Kenyan literature, Eastern African literature, and Western African literature and other African literature will be within the surroundings. So African literature will be in center. And keeping this idea in his mind, Ngogi wa Thiong'o, what did he do? He abolished the Department of English in the Nairobi University. Okay, so he it is in Nairobi University. He demolished Department of English, and he established two departments: Department of Comparative Literature and Department of Comparative Language. Okay. So here, Ngogi wa Thiong'o did the job very effectively and efficiently. That is quite effective for comparative literature. So he demolished Department of English in Nairobi University and divided it in two departments, that is Department of Comparative Literature and Department of Comparative Language. What is his view? What is his view? That every time African literature was not centered in European context. So in African context, African literature will be the center, and the other literature of African other parts will be the surrounding portion of this literature. So towards the identity, African literature got an identity, and the other African literature that like Kenyan literature or like the Eastern African literature will also have the identity in terms of comparative literature. Okay, so that is uh, both Ngogi wa Thiong'o and Chidi Amuda are concerned with that they see a crisis in African literary scholarship. So they found a crisis of the identity, and they did it with their lectures, with their ventures of having comparative literature in a full swing. And as we have learned, that is comparative literature started its journey with the identity, and that identity that will come from literature culture in the same way. So in the post-colonial countries, we see that in order to find out the identity of African literature, that is an extension of comparative literature as well. So in order to find out the identity of African literature, comparative literature also got a solid foundation here. We have seen another writer, that is Nadine Godimer, okay, so South African writer. So he also awarded Nobel Prize she also awarded Nobel Prize in 1991 in literature. Okay, and she was recognized as a woman who taught her magnificent epic writing. Okay, so Nadine Gordimer, what did she say? Nadine Gordimer uh, uh, the confrontation phrase of hostility to European influences, tradition, and methodologies has turned into an African-centered literature style. Okay, so and in which the impact of Europe on African literature is considered along with other, probably most significant influence, such as the continuation of the vernacular oral tradition. Nadine Gordimer endeavoring to define African writing from her perspectives as a white African writer, argues that African writing is writing done in any language by African themselves and by others of whatever skin color who share with uh, African the experience of having been shaped and mentally or spiritually by Africa rather than anywhere else in this world. One must look at the world from Africa to be an African writer, not look upon Africa from the world. So this South African writer Nadine Gordimer pinpoint the point that is African literature had a crisis of their identity. So Nadine Gordimer very fantastically put the definition of African literature. And what is it? That means African writing is writing done any language. So if African writing is written in Giboki language, in English language, in French language, whatever may be the language, African writing will be in any language, and that will be the African, and by the African themselves and by others. And not only the African people will be writing African literature, other people can also write African literature, but in which perspectives? In which perspectives that they have to think Africa from within, not from outside. That means Joseph Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness. That means that is the European. So Joseph Conrad idea towards African literature was imposed on Africa. But Nadine Gordimer said that anybody can write literature that would be the African literature, it may be English or some other else, but matter is that one must look at the world from Africa. That means from Africa, they will be writing. And to be an African writer, not look upon Africa, but from the world. So you have to be any writer. If he or she will be African, he can write in African language, or he or she can write in um, other languages as well. But he or she has to think from the African context, not from the context of outside. And they should be mentally and spiritually attached by African continents. So that is Nadine Gordimer placed in Africa, in African literature. So that was happening in comparative literature in Africa. So we get another writer in African continent, that is Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. And Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is studied most studied novel all over the world in the perspectives of post-colonial literature. Okay, so here uh, if American comparatists can be sure of their starting point, having renamed their literature department in such a way as to abolish the preeminence of English and other European language, where does this leave European comparatist? So Chinua Achebe, he also claimed this question that yeah, he is an influential writer, and he said that yes, we have got an identity, we have got um, the scholarship definition and the terminology of our literature. So what the African literature will be comparing in terms of comparative literature? So he placed that question. So African literature premise that, if universally applicable, would effectively ban any critic from studying any text written outside his or her own culture. And as Johannes Jan comment, that critics of African literature have tended to be racist, nationalist, or individualist. So Sidi Amodas, Chinua Achebe's comment that what will be the comparatist of African literature will be doing. So someone claimed that that yes, African comparative literature and African comparatist will be comparing African literature, culture, or like that. But that was claimed by another, 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 another. That was claimed by another. That was claimed by another writer that that is very much individualistic and nationalist perspectives, that will be comparing only African culture and will be comparing in comparative literature. Okay. So in such a way, so comparative literature was moving on in the other parts of this world. That is, what is the comparative literature, and how comparative literature moved to American, and how comparative literature moved towards the other parts of this world, especially in African. And we have got, that is, other things related to comparative literature. We have got the definition of comparative literature in such a way. So in this way, comparatists from China, from India, from African, and from Latin Americans context are uniting in refuting the European model of cultural periodization. So whenever American literature, we have got the terminology, that is America. Before Columbus's discovery, there had been inhabitants in America. Though there were inhabitants in America, there were language and their identity. In the same way, African literature will have their identity. And African literature, according to many critics, that African literature will be center, and the literature produced in other parts of this world will be the subgenre, that means the of African literature. Once upon a time, before in the other previously, that means European literature was the center, and the other literature were in the periphery. But with the publications, or with the research of several post-colonial authors and researchers, African literature got its center point, and they were creating literature in their own way. And the comparatists of post-colonial countries, they had been comparing literature in their own way. In which way? That means the literature from China, literature from India, and the Africa and the Latin America, they were discarding the periodization of European literature. So European literature will not be a canon at that moment. With the discovery of post-colonial perspectives of comparative literature, African literature, Indian literature, China literature, and Latin American literature got priority from his own shake. And this movement is another example of the ways in which the old ideas of universality of literature and of literary history are being challenged. So once upon a time, before pinpointing the identity of African literature, American literature, Indian literature, Chinese literature, the European literature had been called universal literature, had been called canon of literature, had been called world literature. But with the discovery of the scholar of the definition of post-colonial literature, that idea of, that means the universal idea of the European literature or the canon of world literature that was challenged. And in another way, the literature of Africa, literature of Latin America, literature of Kenya, literature of China, literature of India, they have got their identity in this comparative literature. Okay, so thank you all for attending the class.